Well, let's now speak to Gabriel Elizondo. He joins me now from UN headquarters in New York. Gabe, from yesterday to today to tomorrow, we keep hearing about endless delays, seemingly. Does this mean that, given all the negotiations behind closed doors, that there is a desire to try to move to something, particularly on the part of the US, that it won't veto?
I think so. I mean, a lot of these negotiations are taking place behind closed doors, so we can't get a clear sense of what's being discussed, of course. But one thing is very clear, that it is the U.S. that is holding this up. And we're hearing now, late on Tuesday, it's now two issues. We thought it was one, now we think it's two. The first one is this language about the cessation of hostilities. That was the first language put in the first draft by the United Arab Emirates. And then the U.S. said, we're not going to go for that because it seems like it's almost like a ceasefire language there. The U.S. will not go for that. So they changed it, of course, to the suspension of hostilities. It has a little bit more temporary framing to it. We thought the U.S. would go for that, but apparently there are still some problems with that language as well. Reuters is now reporting Tuesday evening, and our sources at Al Jazeera are confirming, our diplomatic sources, that now there is a second issue as well, and that comes down to a monitoring mechanism that is in this resolution. It's calling for the United Nations to take control of monitoring the aid coming in and also monitoring its distribution as well, and it appears that the U.S. also has some issues with that as well.
Oh, very interesting. Well, you talked there about aid, Gabe. This is intended primarily as a humanitarian resolution. Tell us what the current draft might include.
Well, it is a humanitarian resolution first and foremost. That's what all the diplomats that support this, which is the majority of the council, says. And we heard that from the ambassador to the UAE as well, to the UN. It is calling for a huge scaling up of aid by all means necessary, particularly air, land, and sea. And again, it's not only scaling up that aid, this monitoring mechanism is key as well, because this resolution is saying we want this aid going into Gaza and we want it going in fast and efficiently, but we're not just going to leave it up to Israel to monitor that. This monitoring mechanism would then put the onus on the United Nations to really check that aid, get it into the country quickly to those that need it the most. So it's really multi-pronged approach here, but clearly there are still some real issues here. We are now hearing that the earliest that this resolution could go up to a vote now would be Wednesday at 11 a.m. Eastern time here in New York. That's about 16 GMT. Bottom line is this. Ultimately, the person that will be making the decision for the United States on this will be President Joe Biden. He will ultimately make the call if he demands that his diplomats veto this resolution or not.
Well, we'll be watching that vote, if it happens, very, very closely then indeed. For now, Gabriel Elizondo at the United Nations. Thank you, Gabe. Well, let's bring in Ardi Imseis. He is a professor of international law at Queen's University. He joins us from Ottawa. Ardi, all of these delays, these repeated delays, what do you think we should be reading into them?
I think it's very clear. Yet again, it's a failure by the United Nations Security Council to shoulder its burden to maintain international peace and security, and most importantly, under threat of a U.S. veto, which continues to provide the occupying power with the space, the time, and indeed the weapons to bombard, starve, and ultimately ethnically cleanse the Palestinian people out of Gaza.
Well, do you think that there's potentially more pressure on the U.S. right now, and that's why this has gone on for so long behind closed doors in terms of negotiations, rather than just coming to the Council and then vetoing it?
There may very well be internal discussions happening with the United States. I understand, and this is speculation on my part, that there might be a difference of opinion between, say, the White House and certain elements in the State Department and maybe even the U.S. mission to the United Nations in New York. But at bottom, the reason why why there may be a difference of opinion in the United States is, quite frankly, because of the unhealthy relationship that they share with the occupying power, which has put the United States and Israel and maybe a few other states out on a limb vis-a-vis the rest of the international community, which is calling overwhelmingly for a ceasefire, which is required by all humanitarian means, really.
And we saw that in the General Assembly. Ardi, if a resolution with the current language that we're hearing does get passed in the Security Council, what do you make of the likelihood of implementation? What are the legal requirements, given that it's a Security Council resolution?
Well, I mean, any decision of the United Nations Security Council, which would come through a resolution, would be binding under international law on all member states. That would include the occupying power. And so we'd only have to wait and see what comes out of the Security Council. And that is why, presumably, the United States has been really reluctant to give anything in any Security Council resolution of consequence, because then that would bind the state of Israel. I think one of the most important things your listeners need to be made aware of, however, is that to the extent that any resolution of the Council focuses on humanitarian aid, we need to understand that under international law, the occupying power may never condition humanitarian aid to the protected civilian population that it occupies. And so the whole idea that there should be a quid pro quo, for instance, I'd heard in your segment earlier that the Prime Minister or the President of Israel indicated that they'd want a humanitarian pause in order to allow for aid to go through. No. Under international law, the occupying power has to give that humanitarian aid, facilitate that humanitarian aid unencumbered for the benefit of the civilian population subject to its bombardment. And we have quite the opposite going on now.
You've been very, very clear there. I mean, the resolution that we're talking about now is meant to be a humanitarian resolution, but there have been multiple reports of the Israeli army impeding aid into the Strip, using starvation as a weapon of war. Is there any legal recourse there? And would there be any legal recourse if a resolution was passed and not implemented?
Well, certainly your question covers a few areas. So if a resolution is passed and the occupying power does not adhere to it, then it's left to the Security Council to follow up and impose measures against the occupying power, which it may do and has authority to do under the UN Charter. Those measures can include arms embargoes, diplomatic sanctions, even use of force, if indeed you can get a decision out of the Security Council, which of course is virtually impossible by virtue of the US position. On the other hand, there are still options available for the rest of the international community. The Office of the Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, for instance, who has made a very important point to remind all parties to the conflict, including the occupying power, that humanitarian aid must flow, should take action. And there's an investigation in the situation of Palestine, which he's controlling. And that action might include arrest warrants, indictments, and so on. So there are options available. The only question is there will on the part of those who have their fingers, if you like, on the levers of power to do anything about it. Fingers crossed that over time, well, rather sooner rather than later, there will be some action.
Ardi Imseis there, Professor of International Law at Queen's University. Always great to get your expertise with us here on Al Jazeera. Thank you for joining us, Ardi.
Thank you, Nastasia. All the best.